Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning, this episode will mention self-harm. In William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, one character says, "Sometimes I think it ain't none of us pure crazy and ain't none of us pure sane until the balance of us talks him that away." This Southern Gothic wisdom contains several truths about mental illness, including that it might be best viewed on a spectrum and that medical discourse affects our experience of disorders like BPD in a mighty way. Still, I'm not someone who sees BPD purely as the product of medical discourse, misogyny, and the biases of others. In this, I'm similar to Dr. Merri Lisa Johnson, author of Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, Memoir of a Borderline Personality, and my guest today. Dr. Johnson, who goes by Lisa, also has a PhD in English and directs the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina upstate. Lisa has suggested 3 categories for BPD advocates and theorists. The first, the borderline defenders, treat BPD as a diagnosis imagined and codified by patriarchal authority figures, viewing BPD symptoms as, quote, indices of pervasive social problems such as child abuse, rather than markers of wholly internal disorder, end quote. While I'm sympathetic to this critique and acknowledge the misogynistic history and undertones of the diagnosis, I have suffered debilitating pain from BPD. It is not just a construct to me. Borderline befrienders, according to Lisa, prioritize first-hand testimonies by people with BPD, such as memoirs, social media posts, podcasts, and client interviews, but they still consider BPD to be a construct of medical discourse and medical imaginaries. Borderline upenders, meanwhile, radically redefine, quote, what can be said by feminists about BPD, invoking without subordinating themselves to the diagnosis. They are borderline champions unplugged, refusing to sugarcoat the most bitter parts of their histories. Lisa is a proud borderline upender and self-identified vulnerability artist. When I first contacted Lisa, I didn't quite know how awesome she was. I thought of her as a terrific memoirist, which she is, but I learned that, in addition, she is a trailblazing BPD scholar, part of a vanguard who are tessellating feminist studies, queer studies, disability studies, and lived experience with BPD into a striking and empowering mosaic. Lisa has adopted the term and perspective of Neuroqueer feminism, an intersectional approach that takes cues from disability and queer studies. She writes, quote, "A neuroqueer feminist position on BPD would repeat, amplify, extend, and remix the work of the mad rights movement, resisting compulsory able-mindedness, demanding access to the public sphere as intermittently mad people, complicating without dismissing psychiatric labels, and complicating without dismissing critiques of those labels. It would also allow those of us who feel broken to state it without shame while inviting in those whom second-wave feminism too often ignored, including Black and Indigenous peoples." Lisa is an inspiring advocate for neuroatypicality and a fierce artist with infectious energy. As a fellow writer and a half-hearted academic, I found that her experiences resonated deeply with mine. Plus, after 7 years living on Vancouver Island, it is lovely to hear a Southern accent again. I didn't realize how much I missed them. I lived for 8 years in Florida as a teenager, and I miss Southern accents and expressions. In this interview, we talk about how she presented her real-time experience of BPD in Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, how publishing writing about BPD can hurt us as academics, and necessary self-destructiveness. She'll also read an excerpt from her memoir. It's a banger. So we were just talking before the recording started about how your book Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, Memoir of a Borderline Personality, came out in 2010. And there were a couple of other memoirs that came out around that time, including Loud in the House of Myself and Buddha and the Borderline. But I think before that, there weren't any memoirs by major publishing houses in the US. So it did seem to be, like you said, kind of a moment. I mean, since then, we've gotten a couple of other ones, like Marsha Linehan's book from a few years back, and also a graphic novel by Courtney Cook. So, we are seeing more books, but in 2010, it was kind of a new frontier that you were wading into and giving people some new words for the experience of BPD. And you write really early in Girl in Need of a Tourniquet that even though you were working hard to change your perceptions and reactions to the people around you, the world around you, when you started working on the book, you resisted change, which in turn, you write, limited the memoir to mirror rather than lamp. And so, with that in mind, I'm wondering what was the hardest part about writing this memoir back, kind of the first decade of the 2000s, and what was the most transformative part about it for you?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. So it is a little hard to get back into the mindset
Mm-hmm.
now in 2024. So if the book came out in 2010, I was writing in 2007, 2008,
Right.
2009. But I love the question of thinking about where the challenges were. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you pinpoint a big piece of it, that I was writing before I was better,
Right.
before I was what I hear people now borderline personality self-advocates call being in functional recovery. I was not there at all. And I knew that because I was still in so much pain and sort of having this double consciousness in a way of doing things that I knew were not going to help. I could observe from a certain part of my mind the choices. And I think I even say in the memoir at some point that I would assess something as being not a good idea, and then I would do it anyway. So I
Yeah.
could see that I was in a situation that
Hmm.
I wanted to be out of, but I wasn't out of it. So part of what was hard about writing it was that I was having to balance the goal of writing the story with a sort of ongoing hum of chaos in my own
Right.
life. And also, I don't know, I don't remember, but you're probably right that I said I was resisting it. I don't know if I would now describe that as resisting it. I think that I was just in the totally unavoidable, uncomfortable part where you're at the beginning of knowing something about yourself and knowing that something needs to change, but you don't have the tools yet and you don't have the calm mind to bring to bear on it yet. It
Right.
doesn't feel safe. So you're still kind of doing your same old things that land you in the same old situations. And
But they're what you're used to, So,
yeah, so I
uh,
was resisting it in the sense of still doing the still living the life of a person at the mercy of her emotions,
right,
but I wanted to be further along. I wanted, went to therapy and said, okay, so now we know what it is. What do I got to do? I'm going to be the hardest
right.
working client you've ever had. And she would always just say, trust the process, which I found
Hmm.
really frustrating. But I think there was nothing more for her to say. If she had said, well, you need to just get your patients ready because this is going to take 10 or 15 years.
Right. Yeah,
I don't know that anybody wants to hear that, and it might not even be wise as a therapist to say something like that because I could
right.
imagine it causing a kind of despair.
Yeah,
So I was writing it, at the beginning and as I went along, and so I was just not far enough into the process to be able to tell a story about what it looks like to stabilize yourself, which is
right,
what I think people maybe want from the story.
Right.
but I didn't know yet, and I had to just make peace with that fact. I didn't know. I could see some things, but I didn't know really how to get there. And the other, I would say, kind of related, very hard part about it is, for whatever reason, and I now think that there may be several layers of neurodivergence that I've been navigating all this time without knowing it, is it was hard for me to tell the story in a complete way that was fair to me as a person and that was fair really to the other people in the story. I felt that I wanted to tell the catastrophic parts of the story because those were the parts that I was hiding from people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was unmasking to show this
Mhm.
other part, but because, for whatever, lots of different reasons, but because I didn't have full control over the story, I didn't really see that I wasn't balancing the catastrophic parts of the story with, at least 50%, maybe 70% of my life that was still being spent all that time being a diligent,
Mhm.
cautious, disciplined, ambitious person.
Yeah.
And so I think that it inadvertently fed into the stereotypes that I was explicitly trying to disrupt by telling my story. But I didn't have the realization that all of the readers or the world that the book might come into contact with don't know me. And so they don't know
Right.
the rest of the story. They haven't watched me grow up and they don't know all the ways that I tried to do the right thing and be a good person and
Right.
succeeded at that in lots of ways.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah, you're
so
a teacher. You're a good force in the world. I think it does come through.
I hope so because I had a friend in the publishing business who read it and said, I think you're doing yourself a disservice with this story. And I think you need to tell more of the picture. But I
Mm.
literally at the time, and I think we could make an argument that this is part of BPD experience. I could not see the rest of the story at that
Right.
time.
Yeah.
I didn't feel the truth of the rest of that story. I did feel, in a lot of ways, reduced to the worst
Mm.
stuff that I was experiencing. So, but I have felt since then some disappointment and embarrassment in realizing that if someone only had the book to know about me, that they would take me to be, I think, a different person than I really am, because it
Right.
was the story of the worst part of the storm.
Right.
And so I didn't contextualize that as carefully or thoroughly as I would have if I could have, but that was what was available to me. I love that imagery in yoga classes where a teacher will say, do this pose if it's available to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That wasn't available to me at the
Right.
time. A few different people have said, it might be a good idea to do a sequel and tell maybe more of the story. So I am trying to work on that, and that would be what I would want to do differently this time, to
Hmm.
take my time and layer in just more of kind of the complexity of all of those parts of the picture.
Right. I find, excuse me, everything that you just said so fascinating because one of the things I love about your memoir, which, like you said, is very much focused on a really tumultuous period in your life where you were having a very all-consuming relationship with a woman named Emily. And what I love about it is it almost feels like a historical document. Like this is what I was actually going through in time. It feels very visceral. It feels very raw. And as we talked about a little bit, that all these different BPD memoirs do different things. They have different focuses. And like that yours showed just how on fire you can feel that your life to be. But I also completely understand, just as a writer, I got feedback from one big publisher. They said, well, I absolutely think that we need another, a recent memoir from a woman, particularly a woman with BPD, but I worry that there's too much focus on the suffering here,
Mhm.
and that could increase stigma. And that's really hard. I do,
I'm impressed that a publisher cares about not perpetuating BPD
yeah.
stigma. That's a wonderful measure of what may have changed since then.
Yes, that is a very heartening thing. And I did realize that they were right because I kind of was going through a resurgence of symptoms due to menopause, and I hadn't yet started finding my way out yet. So I did change it to focus more on the healing. But I love that there is a book out there that is just this is what it's like to be in the thick of it. And I actually asked a researcher, Sarah Maslin, who studies BPD stigma particularly, well, do you think people should kind of hold back when they write about their own BPD, about the worst part? And she said, stigma is really slippery. I can't say for sure, but I don't think sugarcoating anything helps. So I completely respect your feelings about it, and I would love a sequel to this book to read anything more from you. But I wonder how different how what the reactions are. I'm sure there are some people who really appreciate that kind of the chaotic elements of it.
I appreciate you saying that. And I have gotten some feedback from readers over the
Yeah.
years that I have treasured, who have reached out and said, thank you for telling the story of what this really feels like
Right.
and admitting to it, and making me feel less alone.
Yeah.
And that was my goal. I mean, it really was. And I've been thinking and writing about that too, that, there have been people who didn't like the book. There have been people who've treated me differently because of the book, and people who actually loved it and needed it. And they're the ones that I wrote it for. So
Right.
for those who hated it, I've layered reactions, but one of them, the one where, of course, I care about everyone's experience, that layer is, yes, I can see the shortcomings from your perspective and would
Mm.
imagine doing it differently now. But the other layer and the kind of gut reaction would be, then it wasn't for you.
Right. Yeah.
So I like that idea that you shared of it just kind of being a historical document that is a
Hmm.
trace, like Mia Mingus, the
Yeah.
disability justice
Yeah.
thinker, writes about leaving traces. That was my trace. Being in such a maelstrom of pain and
Yeah.
confusion and isolation that it wasn't clear to me that I was going to survive it. It really
Right.
wasn't.
Yeah.
So, for people who also might be feeling that and thinking like I did, my God, what is this malfunctioning that's happening and how can I hide it? Because surely, no one would understand or share it.
Yeah.
To be able to put the story out, to reach a hand out and say, no, you're not alone. In
Right.
fact, kind of common. And the fact that we don't know about it is really unfair and
Yeah.
unfortunate. Someone actually, an interviewer a long time ago said, oh, you mix in stories about Princess Diana. Do you think of yourself as connected to them or similar to them? It seemed
Right.
like a question like, are you delusionally imagining that you are among
Right.
this string of celebrities? But
Right.
but it wasn't that at all. I saw how people like Princess Diana were written about in these shocked tones. And that to me seemed sexist, it seemed
Yeah.
an unfair writing
Definitely.
off of women when they don't find it possible to control themselves at all times or act the way that
Yeah.
you're conditioned or taught is appropriate. I remember the grandmother who raised me, who I treasure and miss so much, but I still remember things that she said that didn't feel good and a lot of things that she said that did feel good. That's all there. But I remember her saying to me once, maybe kind of close to that time period, I think you like to shock people. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, that is incorrect. I've heard you and others think and say similar things. I don't like to shock people. I want a world where people are less easily shocked.
Right.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
Because I don't think this is shocking. It shocks me that people are shocked by it because
Right.
it seems so human to get brought low and to unravel. So
Hmm.
all of that seemed really unfair. I wanted to be part of a kind of cultural force that was remediating that unfairness to say,
Right.
this is also part of the truth of our lives and
Yeah.
it needs to be factored in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a culture, at least in the kind of Western cultures I'm most familiar with, we're very uncomfortable when people have what others see as an excess emotions, even though everyone has that at some point. They lose someone, someone dies, they feel grief, they want to wail. It's just maybe people with BPD have them with greater frequency at certain points in their lives, but it is a universal experience. You're a professor and the director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina, upstate. And in the period you're describing in the book, you were a professor. And, as you say, you talk very openly about your history with mental illness, with self-harm. And I'm wondering, were you worried about whether this book would endanger your academic career? And if so, what made you willing to go forward with it despite the risks? Because as an academic too, I think it's very brave.
I thank you for calling it brave. I think that was the principle that I was standing on, that it's the right thing to do, to be brave and tell the truth, even when it may not be what people want to hear, and even
Right.
when it may cost you something.
Mhm.
But because I was young and inexperienced, very much at the beginning of my career, I didn't really know
Yeah.
or fully grasp the degree to which it could maybe constrain my own career advancement. I just maybe idealistically chose to believe that it wouldn't. And several things come to mind. First of all, in graduate school, I mean, my very first semester, I was introduced to the writings of Audre Lorde. I was electrified by her mandate to her
Mhm.
readers to take on a kind of fearlessness,
Right.
a warrior stance that was characterized by truth telling. And when I read that, I couldn't imagine being or becoming that person, but I wanted to. I believed in it. I loved what she said, quoted so many times, but you can stay quiet in the corner, mute as bottles,
Right. Yeah.
and they will still try to grind you down.
Right.
So you might
Yeah.
as well speak,
Right.
but they're going to grind you down either way.
Absolutely.
So I just kind of took that from her and other risk-taking feminist
Right.
writers, Audre and Rich, Bell Hooks, Nancy
I was thinking
Ayres.
bell hooks in this context too. Yeah.
And I think Nancy Mears doesn't get enough credit for being part of that tradition. She's a disability advocate. She's no longer alive, but I read all of her essay collections and her wonderful memoir, Remembering the Bone House. And I just really reveled in books where women would tell unflattering truths about themselves,
Right.
because it did that work that I wanted to do for readers. It made me
Yeah.
feel not alone. And also it allowed me to move away from, Nancy Mears writes a lot about getting out from under shame.
hmm
So it allowed me to move away from the shame that's associated with masking or keeping kind of
Right.
silencing yourself about these parts of your life, and to just say what the truth is and to search for meaning in it that might matter to you and might matter to other people. I think, again, idealistically, I thought it's already been established by these writers that this is the right thing to do.
Right.
So this is where maybe some other layers of neurodivergence come into play,
hmm
where I have a very sharp sense around injustice
Right.
and standing on
Me
principle
too.
and doing the right thing as you understand it.
hmm
And so I miscalculated in a way how widespread the acceptance might be of those
hmm
principles, which are really coming from a small group of pretty
Right.
marginalized women. But I hoped to add to that legacy of literature to be another
Yeah.
voice in that tradition. And I just didn't know that much about professional politics and how that might come back to haunt me. Although
Mhm.
I do remember saying to my dissertation director, I want to write like Nancy Mears. And she said, Nancy Mears doesn't work for a state institution.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I was warned, but I
Hmm.
thought, no, no. And then the other part of it is you have to picture me for years in bookstores just scouring the autobiography section for
Right.
beautifully rendered portraits of struggles that different
Right.
women had gone through. So I wanted to be part of that too. I was
Hmm.
reading bipolar narratives, I was reading depression narratives, all
Right.
the way again to grad school where I just stumbled across Elizabeth Wurtzel's Prozac
Hmm.
Nation.
Right.
And I, read every new book of hers that came
Hmm.
out. So I was immersing myself in a body of literature that I wanted to be part of.
Right.
And it was not representative of what the world is, what mainstream
Yeah.
culture is, what, university workplaces are like or
Yeah.
expect. So my norms were different, but I think that's okay. Maybe it's better that I didn't know enough to be calculating and to think about risk and let that drive me. I
Right.
just thought I'm going to tell the truth
Yeah.
and share this for those who would benefit from it so that they are not also like I was sitting in their apartments falling apart with no sense of community or
Yeah.
possibility or meaning making tools, because a lot of the
Absolutely.
book is like scavenger work where I found all these little
Hmm.
bits of information and compiled it to say, like, here's your toolbox. Like this,
Yeah.
these are the pieces that gave me some leverage to get out of the
Yeah.
stuck place that I was in. So I want to give those away. I will say I have been lucky in my career. There have been some comments that I haven't been really comfortable with from a few
Right.
colleagues. But there have been other colleagues who have been great supporters and validators and helped me not take those little bruises from a few people to
Yeah.
be the most meaningful part of the response that I've gotten. And I've been at this job and in this position for 18 years as of like next week, I think is the
Mm.
anniversary. So I've weathered some uncomfortable moments and,
Right.
sometimes new people will come in and learn about the work anew,
Yeah.
even though it's so many years later. And I'll
Right.
feel like I'm then read through a lens that it isn't
Hmm.
really fair to read me through now. So there hasn't been catastrophic loss. But what I have been writing about lately is I do think that advancing into other positions at other
Hmm.
universities has been possibly affected by it. I don't know
Yeah.
how much, but I've
Yeah.
gotten the implication from certain things that have been said that it has operated as a question mark,
Right.
may not have worked in my favor with search committees
Mm.
where I've been, finalist and well
Yeah.
received in a lot of ways. I think BPD stigma has limited or shaped where I've been able to go,
Right.
but I wouldn't take it back. I still think making a decision not to share the story out of fear that someone will harm me through stigma just isn't, it's just not a choice that I could have comfortably made.
Right.
I wouldn't even now feel right about it, although I might tell the story differently now. I don't want to be led by fear. I don't want self-protection to be more important than community building and stigma fighting.
I feel much the same way. And I think that whenever you embrace this kind of radical vulnerability, there is a self-destructive component. Like you mentioned the work of Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, and they're talking about these systemic injustices that condition our experience. I think in the society we live in, there's always going to be a self-destructive component of being open about things, especially mental health conditions as a woman. But I think it's necessary because I struggled. Is this just me being self-destructive? Well, of course it's self-destructive to not toe the party line of, this is how we're supposed to behave, this is how we're supposed to act or write about or talk about ourselves. But it's a necessary self-destruction. And hopefully, like you
I
said,
love
it could,
that ways. Uh-huh.
Yeah, like
I love that. Yeah, because if you prioritize self-protection over honest, searching communication and art
right,
making, then you, I think, make the stigma stronger
right. I
because
agree.
you're accepting it
Hmm.
and you're working around it
Yes. And
instead
writing around
of
it and yeah.
calling it out and saying,
Hmm.
the problem is you're not always present when someone says or does
Sure.
something stigmatizing about you.
Yeah.
And that's the part that you can't really control. But I have tried to take opportunities to write essays here and there, actually describe myself as a vulnerability artist who uses
Mm, I like that.
vulnerability as a tool to fight ableism, to fight sexism. And maybe there are other safer tools, but I don't know. I don't have them. They're not the ones that
Yeah.
they don't get me to the places that I'm trying to go in
Hmm.
terms of the subject matter.
Yeah. I love the term vulnerability artist. That's beautiful.
I
Did
took that from Jose Munoz, if you know his work in
no.
queer theory, but I
Um,
thought it really applied. That's what it is, to use your
mhm.
vulnerability as a strength, or even like you could take being uninhibited as
Mhm.
a negative, as a symptom of a disorder.
Yeah.
But I think being uninhibited is a strength and it
Yeah.
is a form of bravery that I'm not
Mhm.
afraid of what you think of about me. And if you
Right.
think terrible things about me, I think it's because you haven't really conducted searching,
Hmm.
well-informed, critical thinking about what we're talking about.
Right.
So my stance really has been for those who are judging me, not that I could never be in the wrong, because I
Mm.
certainly think that there are things in the book I could have done that still would have gotten my point across and might have not been as stark or painful to read and might have given a fuller picture of the person called Emily in the book. It's hard to live with, that there are
Yeah.
lines that I probably would do differently now and should have done
Mhm.
differently then. So again, I'm
Yeah.
not saying I can't be in the wrong,
Right.
but in general, I do feel that when judgment comes at me about things that I divulge in the book, I think that the person judging is the person in the wrong. And I think
Right.
that they have not pushed themselves to think about
Mm.
what the purpose of the story is and maybe take it on the surface level as a kind of self-indulgent confession
Right.
that is gleefully recounting bad
Hmm.
behavior. And
Right.
that's not the story that I told. And
Right.
if there are parts that sound like that, then that's just a measure of, my limitation as a growing writer at the time.
Yeah.
That was not where I was coming from. I
Mhm.
often describe the book as a story about the absence of wise mind,
Mhm.
from
Mhm.
from Buddhist thinking. I'm not flaunting. I'm not
Yeah.
proud. I'm not proud that I was in an affair. I'm not proud that
Mm.
I was reduced to, a puddle of a person.
Yeah.
But I did feel that revealing those moments was a gesture of generosity toward other people who also experience those sorts of moments. That's how I meant it, was
Yeah.
generosity, because
Mhm.
that's how I feel when I come across those sorts of passages, that this person's being extremely generous to
Yeah.
share
Me
this with
too.
me instead of withholding it.
Hmm.
So it's just a different mindset. But unfortunately, unless you have a little booklet of instructions that you can walk around with to pass out whenever you interact with people, you're not necessarily going to take it the way it was intended. But again, I think it finds the readers that need it.
Right.
And that one of my duties in this life is to be strong enough to
Mhm.
withstand judgmental moments from people who did not who did not experience the book
Mhm.
as a friendly gesture or gift
Right.
or a kind of rigorous self-reflection on my own self-destructive patterns,
Right.
which again, is what I thought I was doing. And I thought that that was a very principled thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one area where, I mean, it doesn't feel good when it happens, but I
Yeah.
think that it is my job to just be strong enough to withstand the discomfort of those
Mm.
exchanges and to know
Yeah.
that those are credible, but that they are not the only and maybe not the most important parts of how the book is taken. It's not just about the career. It's about like
Yeah.
what person do you want to be? It's about how do you live with integrity as an
Right.
artist and an
Yeah.
activist while you are also dependent on employment from a state institution, a state university.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And,
It's about
and
how
that's
you,
not easy.
yeah, balancing how you want to spend your time on this earth, which is so
Mhm.
fleeting with
Yeah.
capitalism too. It's just all those different poles. But I relate to everything that you're saying. Would you like to read an excerpt from the book? I know I was going to do that
I
towards the
will.
beginning, but I think it will work nicely to end with it as well.
So I think what I will read, because one thing that I like about the book that I think
Mm,
may not be obvious always to people is that I was bringing humor to bear on it,
definitely.
because I didn't want to just be complaining and
Hmm.
complaining about fights with my girlfriend and
Yeah.
complaining about the little details in conflicts with my mother. So I think I will read from the part where I tried to describe the dynamics between me and my mother, but using imagery pretty much almost 100% instead of a story about a thing she said to me that
Right.
bothered me.
Yeah.
I think one of the defining moments of my life was when I told her, pulled up my 11-year-old strength and just bravery and vulnerability and pulled it all up and walked into her room and said, I want to live with Dad.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
she said, he doesn't want you. He's
Right.
not even your real father. That changed the course of my emotional life in ways
Yeah.
that I've recently realized nobody around me knew. Like I
Hmm.
mentioned it to my father a few years ago, and he had not, he said, oh, yeah, she did say that, didn't she? So
Right.
he was not living with that all of that time, and he was not
Yeah.
realizing that I was living inside
Right.
that rejection and that alienation and really that
Yeah.
fear and anxiety. Like, is he my father? I don't know. It was a wedge that
Mhm.
distanced me from what I thought of as the good side of my family and the side that raised me.
Mhm.
So I was living with them, but her parting gift to me was almost like it is like a fairy tale or a curse,
Yeah.
you can go, but you're going to take this doubt with you,
Right.
what you think is your fairy tale ending. You're going to
Yeah.
take it out. So there are a lot of ways I guess I could have told that story, but I did try to take a kind of humorous look at it
Hmm.
and talk about what she seemed like instead of what was literally happening. Actually read part of this at there's a Southern literary gathering every
Hmm.
year in New Orleans called Saints and Sinners.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
Had to pick a passage that would fit there that was queer
Right.
and maybe queer not just in the sense of being about a lesbian
Hmm.
related catastrophe, but also kind of queer in its emotional stance, taking a caustic,
Yeah.
playful, but edgy, using laughter as a tool to manage painful emotional
Right.
experience. My mother throws shade like a legendary drag queen. She brings out secrets with the sharp surprise of a blade beneath the tongue. Your sister is my favorite. He doesn't want you. He's not even your real father. She points at my body and
Mhm.
laughs at my modesty and tells my father when I grow pubic hair. She mocks me for thinking I have something to hide. I play
Mhm.
straight man to her comedy routine like a breeder at the queer cabaret. Do not try to pass as well adjusted in this place, the queen warns. Show us your bangy realness before we scratch off that mask you call a face. If I am too loud or too slow or too needy, she tells
Mhm.
me to cram it and get lost. That literally is true. Go play in the street. Take a long walk off a short pier. I step
Mhm.
out of her limelight and to hotness and retreat to another room where I rock my baby sister to sleep. Two losers clutching each other in the dark and calling it a hug. My red face and tangled hair tell the truth about this moment. I cry like rejection hurts, but really I'm seething and planning to leave. At 11, I'm already more criminal than martyr. The image of one sister comforting another is a trick, backlit and cropped tight. In the shadows outside the frame, a rubber mallet and several large garbage bags sit neatly by my feet. Light as a feather, stiff as a board, I lie still enough to disappear. I say, Candyman, Candyman, Candyman. I'd rather be anywhere other than here. I choose the company of demons over my drag of a mother. She confuses meanness with having a ball. She reads me, but doesn't get me at all. I'm going to stop there because I don't want it to be too long, but I want to add just a couple of thoughts about it that you
Absolutely. I love that. I love the I'm more criminal than martyr at 11. Oh,
But you know,
it's
that's a perfect example
mm,
of a line that hasn't served me personally because it's like the story of a terrible person. But what I was trying to get across was
mhm.
that I wasn't lying down and taking it. But I was coming up with an escape plan, and I did escape, packed my things up in paper Ingalls bags,
Yeah,
and snuck out the front door and hid them. Like if I got caught, I couldn't imagine what her reaction was going to be. Then, when I was picked up to leave for the weekend, we stopped and picked them up and I didn't come back.
right.
And there's something funny and kind of hyperbolic about describing that as being more criminal than martyr.
Right.
I wasn't being a criminal. I was doing what my therapist later described as one of my flights toward health. I
Right.
was remaking my life to be something that I could inhabit and
Mhm.
something that would not be ripping me apart every day.
And you were
So
11. Of course you weren't a criminal. I mean, to me, I related to that formulation so much because you can be treated as one when you're doing self-preservation at that age or at any age, but especially when you're a child. And I thought that just came through so brilliantly.
I want to say lovingly toward my 11-year-old self, something really strong. And I even want to say something kind of badass. That person saying, I'm not taking this. And being willing to leave my own mother, that's what it takes to be in a place where I
Yeah.
could let my guard down and become a strong, stable person. And although
Right.
I did end up having such terrible experiences of chaos in my 20s and
Mm.
30s, the truth is, I did make a strong, stable person who then
Mhm.
encountered some really triggering environments that I wasn't
Right.
expecting to be so triggering. But there was a lot of strength and a lot that I
Mm.
thank that 11-year-old for. And to say almost like, I'm sorry for calling you criminal. That's not what I'm
Right.
trying to be funny. But what I didn't tell was your story, younger version of me, in this more balanced, loving, tender way that could acknowledge your strength, your
Mm.
fear, your dedication to your own health. Like
Yeah.
that's beautiful. And I should have
Yes.
said those things about that version of me. That's the way that we internalize and kind of reproduce and
Mhm.
become our own abusers is by telling the ugly story, telling it in an ugly way. But that's where I was stuck at that time. But here's the other thing that's really kind of beautiful about what happened. So my mother read the book. She has since died. She died when she was
Mm.
59. But she read the book and she was a voracious reader and she was the person who got me into reading at a very young age. But she loved the book. I think people
That's
would
great.
assume she wouldn't have.
Right. Yeah.
She loved it and she said, "When can you write another?"
Oh,
When
that's really beautiful.
And she also said, I'm really surprised that it bothered you that I told
Hmm.
you he wasn't your father.
Hmm.
And she still was like, I don't understand why that bothered you. And I thought, what in the world kind of psychologically and emotionally limited person can't put two and two together of why
Yeah.
me? But I was so glad we were it was like a Gmail chat.
Right.
So grateful we did that because I would never have known her thinking. She said, I would have thought you would have loved the idea of being a love child. You didn't
Right.
us that you came from me and this person
Hmm.
who I loved. So why wouldn't you gravitate towards this idea of yourself as a love child? Now, to be fair, she slung that at me like a dagger.
Right.
So she wasn't inviting me into some beautiful love story.
Right.
But it did show me a little more of the picture from her perspective
Right.
that she was breaking, she was being left by my father at the time, and it hurt, And so I think it was like a fantasy story. She loved romantic fantasies.
Right.
It was just a kind of a fantasy. And why wouldn't that be a lovely kind of alternative story? That's not where it came from when she said it, but over time, that was
Right.
part of how she thought about it. But it
Yeah.
mattered to me that the book didn't hurt her. Now, it may also be symptomatic again of her own limitations and the very thing that
Right.
made it painful to live near and to love. But it's interesting to me that the comparison between parents, my safe parent, my father, who I went to for
Right.
safety, didn't read it because he was afraid to see what I might have said. So,
But your
but
mom had this openness about it. Yeah.
I really admire her capacity to go into the book and to say nothing but positive things to me about.
Right.
Like that's healing. That was
Right.
beautiful.
And I think that just speaks to like the surprise of writing a book and publishing a book that you can have those things happen. And I'm so grateful that you wrote it, and I'm so grateful that you talked to me. I mean, Lisa, thank you so much. All of this was just so giving and so generous, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking the questions and creating the space for the conversation. It's nice to be invited into a conversation about
Mhm.
complexities, to not let me get too far into my corner of anxiety and hurt people and,
Mhm.
what have I done?
There always is like a much bigger story than even we see as writers, as readers, as livers of our lives. But thank you so much.